She never meant to start a war. All she wanted was to wipe that arrogant smile off his face. "Rich men don't know how to please women," she said flatly, taking a sip of her drink before adding with quiet pride, "You couldn't handle me anyway." But the man she was teasing was not just rich. He was a Mafia kingpin. And when he leaned in, his voice brushing against her ear as he whispered, "Care to bet?" Everything in her life changed. The rooftop bar in downtown Chicago was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey. Soft jazz mingled with the low hum of bass from the floor below, like the slow heartbeat of a city that never slept. Golden light reflected off wide glass panels, illuminating a skyline glittering through the night as if reminding everyone that this was no place for the weary. Charlotte Monroe stood alone at the bar, her cocktail nearly gone, but she still didn't feel any better. She wasn't poor, yet she had no real reason to spend her evening watching the wealthy flaunt their importance. Her black dress bore no designer label, but it fit her perfectly. Her hair fell in loose, natural waves over her shoulders, her makeup understated. Charlotte didn't try to draw attention, yet somehow she did. She was there because her best friend, Ella, had dragged her out after a long, exhausting week managing events at the hotel where she worked. Ella had told her she needed a little life, a reminder of the world outside of schedules and inboxes. Charlotte had to admit, at least the view was beautiful enough to make her forget the tension of endless meetings. That was when she saw him. At first, she thought he was just another powerful man in an expensive suit, white shirt, black vest, eyes as dark as midnight. But there was something in the air around him that shifted when he moved. When he walked, people naturally stepped aside. When he stopped, the whole room seemed to pause with him. It wasn't about money. It was about control. He sat at a corner table with 3 other men, all dressed in dark tones, their eyes scanning the room more than their glasses. His expression didn't change even when people came by to greet him. The way he looked calm, sharp, certain spoke of someone far too familiar with owning everything he touched. Charlotte tilted toward the bartender. "Who's that?" she asked. The bartender hesitated for a second before answering quietly, "Better if you don't know, Miss Monroe." The reply only deepened her curiosity. Ella leaned closer. "That's Dominic Valenti." Charlotte raised a brow. "Sounds like a villain from a crime movie." "He's not an actor," Ella murmured. "They say he owns a chain of shipping docks, but everyone knows nothing about it is legal." Charlotte chuckled, shaking her head. Rich men always think money buys them everything, even people. She didn't realize her voice was just loud enough for others to hear, including Dominic. He turned, and his gaze caught hers. For a brief second, Charlotte forgot to breathe. She turned away immediately, yet she could still feel his eyes burning through her. "Don't look back," Ella whispered. "He's dangerous." "I'm not looking," Charlotte replied. "I'm just standing. You're provoking him." "Good," she said, taking another sip. "Someone should." Dominic stood. He buttoned his jacket, unhurried yet deliberate. The 2 men beside him exchanged glances but said nothing, letting him pass. The sound in the bar seemed to quiet, as if the whole room held its breath. He walked straight toward the bar, where Charlotte stood motionless. When he stopped in front of her, she looked up, surprised that he was taller than she expected. His scent cedarwood and quiet authority hung between them. "You think that was funny?" he asked, voice low and steady. Charlotte tilted her head. "Which part?" "The part about rich men." His tone was even cold. "It was just a personal opinion." "Based on what?" "Experience," she said without blinking. "They think they can buy whatever they want and disappear without explanation." Dominic studied her face, his gaze tracing from her eyes to her lips and back. "And you think I'm one of them?" "That's what I said." He leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping, almost a whisper. "What makes you so sure?" Charlotte straightened, smiling faintly. "Because men like you never know how to please a woman who can't be bought." He didn't blink. "Is that a challenge?" "Maybe." He took half a step closer, his voice a low vibration near her ear. "You think I can't handle you?" Her pulse quickened, but she didn't step back. "I don't think," she said. "I know." His mouth curved, not in amusement but in something darker, deeper. He tilted his head, his breath warm against her skin. "Care to bet?" She didn't know that one. Careless line, uttered in the noise of a crowded bar, would become the spark that set off a storm. Now, let's step into that moment when their eyes met for the first time, and the challenge that would change both their lives forever. She didn't think he'd react. No one ever did. No one had ever looked at her as though she were a mystery to solve, a dare waiting to be met. But Dominic Valenti was different. When he said, "Care to bet?" his voice was deep, certain, and not remotely playful. He wasn't flirting for fun. He said it like he'd just placed the whole world on the table. Charlotte blinked, not out of confusion, but to steady herself against the strange pull forming between them. She didn't like being read so easily. Yet Dominic was doing exactly that, watching her as though he could see through her in seconds. "I don't bet with men I don't know," she said, half defiant, half guarded. He tilted his head, his dark brown eyes glinting with a touch of green, beneath the amber lights. "Then let me fix that." He held out his hand. "Dominic Valenti." She glanced at it briefly before shaking. "Charlotte Monroe, but my friends call me Charlie. And am I a friend or a rival?" "Depends," she said, sipping her cocktail. "How do you plan to handle me?" Dominic's lips curved, not quite into a smile. "No one's ever asked me that before." "Then this is a first." "I like firsts," he said, eyes never leaving hers. The simple words, the way he spoke them, made time slow, not rushed, not eager, but utterly controlled. Charlotte wasn't sure if it was the drink or the nearness of him, but her heart was beating faster than usual. She stepped back, keeping a measured distance. "Thanks for the drink. I didn't buy you one. Then I don't owe you anything." She turned, but his voice followed, quiet, steady. "You said I couldn't handle you. But I think you're afraid you might be wrong." She stopped, turned, eyes sharp as a blade. "I'm not afraid of being wrong. I just hate wasting time." Dominic moved closer, slow and certain, not invading but close enough to stretch the air tight between them. "Then let me prove otherwise." "Prove what?" "That not every rich man is hollow." She looked at him, silent for a few seconds. The way he stood, spoke, even breathed, carried a confidence she rarely saw. "You always think you're right, don't you?" "No," he said softly. "I just don't step into fights I know I'll lose." "Then don't step into this one." "Too late," he replied. "I already have." Charlotte exhaled, short and tense. She didn't want to admit she felt the pull of a dangerous game, but she didn't want to walk away either. Not out of pride, but because a part of her one she'd locked away after years of disappointment was stirring awake. Dominic wasn't her type. Too rich, too powerful, too dangerous. Yet he wasn't, like the rest. No boasting, no pretending, no need to prove himself. He simply stood there, and silence followed. He commanded respect, and that frightened her most of all. Because if she wasn't careful, she could be drawn into a world that wasn't hers. She left the bar, his gaze following each step, but before disappearing from his sight, she turned back. "Fine," she said, meeting his eyes. "Try me. But if you lose, don't expect me to be gentle." Dominic said nothing. He only nodded. But something in his eyes shifted, not curiosity, but conviction. And Charlotte knew, whether she retreated or not, one thing was certain. She had just opened a door that would never close again. Dominic remained by the bar, his eyes following the line of Charlotte's back until she disappeared into the crowd. He did not smile, and he did not look triumphant. He simply grew thoughtful, as if he were studying a complicated blueprint that had just unfolded in front of him. No one had ever spoken to him the way she just had. No one had ever challenged him in public, much less with such frankness and absence of fear. That defiance did not irritate him. On the contrary, it stirred something he had not felt in a very long time. The sensation of a match whose outcome could not be predicted, a rare kind of interest that did not come from power or control but from uncertainty. Dominic Valenti was not accustomed to unknown results. He ran everything with cold calculation, precise step by step, from the chain of maritime freight companies and the logistics web stretched across ports from the East Coast to the Midwest, to the shadowy political connections people in his world only dared to whisper about. He was the hand on the strings, and he preferred it that way. His life was a labyrinth for which he always held the map. But Charlotte Monroe had entered like an unexpected gust that made the lights flicker, not strong enough to tear the house down, yet enough to make him rise and check the windows. When he returned to his table, Dominic no longer cared about the unfinished conversation with Marco or the two guests beside him. He lifted his whiskey, turned it once, and gave a quiet order. "I want to know who she is." Marco did not ask a single question. He nodded and vanished into the dark the way he always did. Dominic knew he would come back with everything: name, profession, address, morning habits, even the way she liked her coffee. To others, that might look like intrusion, even a disease of control. To Dominic, it was defense. He never let a stranger draw close without knowing whether a blade might be hidden in a coat. When Marco returned in less than an hour, the report was crisp and spare. Charlotte Monroe, 42 years old, senior events manager at a boutique hotel in the heart of Chicago, divorced, living alone in a small apartment near Grant Park, with no ties to any organization, faction, or special interest. A clean file. So clean that Dominic found it unnatural. "Has she ever been tailed?" he asked, voice mild yet firm enough to make Marco straighten slightly. "No sign of it. She keeps her life private, dislikes social media, leaves almost no trace." Dominic nodded. People like that were fiercely independent, but they also drew attention if they suddenly stepped beneath a spotlight as bright as the one that illuminated his life. He knew he should not move closer. Charlotte would have been a simple equation if left alone. A chance encounter, a small dare exchanged by two strangers. He could have let it pass like 100 other moments that meant nothing. But he did not. He did not want to. The next day, Dominic placed a man on the corner near the hotel where she worked. No interference, no theatrics, only observation. When she stepped out at 8:15 in the morning, heavy coat on, coffee in hand, eyes on her phone, Dominic sat in a car half a block away. He watched through dark glass and said nothing. She walked with a steady strength, unhurried but decisive. No high heels, only low heels neat enough for work and practical enough to run if she had to. Practical. Exact. Like him, he liked that. When she paused at a red light, he caught the brief moment she lifted her head toward the street. A glance so quick, yet enough to make his heart skip for half a beat. She did not see him. He did not look away. For the first time, he sensed something slipping beyond his grasp. And he knew that whether or not she turned back, he had stepped into a contest whose opponent was not a crime family, not the police, not a politician, but an ordinary woman who showed no fear, who did not need his rescue, and who would not easily bend. A woman like Charlotte Monroe. And that was precisely why Dominic could no longer retreat. Charlotte did not notice the black sport utility vehicle idling about 20 meters from the corner cafe. She did not notice the man in a brown coat at the pastry case. Hands, empty, eyes tracking her through the glass. To her, this Monday morning moved like any other. She arrived 15 minutes early to check the setup for a client event, reviewed the banquet floor plan, ordered a latte as usual, and braced for the unending river of emails. Yet one thing was not like the others. At about 11:30, just as she sank into a chair in the staff lounge to eat a quick lunch over a cold salad, her phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number. Only one line. "I am inviting you to lunch today. Luca's on Clark Street. A car will pick you up at exactly 12. Dominic." She blinked at the screen, mind blank for a heartbeat. She had not saved his number, and she had not granted him any right to access her after that night. Yet he had her number. He knew where she worked, when she took lunch, even what she liked to eat. She looked at the clock. "Half an hour." She hesitated. "Ignore it." Reply with frost. Instead of any rational response, she opened the chat and typed one short line, neither verbose nor polite. "How did you get my number?" The answer arrived at once. "I asked." People answered. She tightened her grip on the phone, that familiar prickle of losing control nudging at her nerves. She did not like other people assigning her schedule. She did not like anyone who believed that commands would make her obedient, but the thing that unsettled her was not that annoyance. It was the curiosity rising beneath it, about him, about that scorching gaze from the night before, about the way her body remembered the words, "Care to bet." At last she replied, "I have 1 hour. If the food is bad, I leave early." One line appeared. "I do not let people go hungry." At exactly 12 o'clock, a black car stopped at the service entrance of the hotel. The driver opened the rear door with quiet courtesy and nothing more than a nod. Charlotte slid in, mind still wrestling reason against feeling. She reminded herself that this was only lunch, only a psychological game between two strong people, nothing more, nothing less. Yet when the restaurant doors opened, she knew she had been wrong. The room was elegant without ostentation. Old brick walls, low pendant lights casting a warm glow, a thread of lemon and rosemary in the air. Dominic was already seated at a corner table by the window, back resting lightly against the chair, charcoal suit cut to perfection. He stood when he saw her. That surprised her. No one had ever stood for her before. Not her ex-husband, not a business partner, not a male colleague. But Dominic Valenti rose to his feet, as if it were instinct. "Charlotte," he said, no smile, only that unshifting gaze. "Thank you for coming." "I came for curiosity, not consent," she answered, taking the seat across from him, her eyes steady. He nodded. "I know." They ordered. The initial quiet was not tense. It was the quiet of two fighters measuring distance before the bell. He asked about her work, the events she ran, how she carried pressure. She answered selectively, not too open, not defensive either. Then her phone vibrated again. Another message, another unknown number. She looked. "Do not be seduced by the suit. He is dangerous." She lifted her head and her eyes changed. Dominic was watching her, expression unreadable. "Something wrong? Do you send the same message twice from two different numbers?" "Not me," he said without glancing at the screen. "Then who?" "Someone is watching you. And me." The words dried her throat. "You knew." "I suspected. Now it is confirmed." "Why?" "Because you are sitting at this table with me. That is all." "In my world," Dominic said, his voice lower. "Anyone who sits at my table makes a statement." She studied him for a long moment. Then she closed the phone and set it on the table. "What are we stating then?" "That you are not easily bought. And I am not easily threatened." Charlotte drew a slow breath. This lunch was no longer a simple meeting. It had become something else, a boundary, and she had just crossed it. The black car was waiting again in front of the hotel the next morning. No message. No reminder. Just the same driver in a white shirt and black vest, standing beside the vehicle with a calm face, as if picking her up every morning had always been part of the plan. Charlotte stood in the lobby for a moment, a cup of hot coffee in her hand, staring at the car before turning away to order an Uber like usual. But when the app showed a 15-minute wait time and the cold wind outside sliced against her skin, she paused. She hated this feeling, being followed without consent, being cared for without boundaries. She despised not being the one behind the wheel, but she also hated being late for meetings. She stepped closer, gave the driver a small nod, and got in. The leather seats smelled new, warm, and clean. No music, no small talk. Only silence and the steady rhythm of the car weaving through Chicago's rush-hour streets. Dominic didn't call. He didn't text. But every day, the car appeared on time, and each time, she asked herself the same question. Was this protection or control? It wasn't a question she could answer easily, because Dominic Valenti didn't force her. He never demanded, never ordered, never made promises. He simply existed, like a long shadow behind her, one that made her feel safe and suffocated at once. That weekend, when she took a walk through Grant Park, the car followed at a distance, not close enough to alarm, but near enough for her to know it was there. She stopped by the fountain, pretending to check her phone, then turned sharply. The driver quickly looked away. She pulled out her phone and typed, "If I'm not a hostage, then stop sending someone after me when I walk." A minute later, Dominic replied, "He's not following you. He's making sure no one else does first." She frowned, still the same tone, calm, logical, impossible to refute completely. But it didn't soothe her. That evening, when she returned home, a small box sat at her doorstep. No name, no note, just a sleek black box. She opened it. Inside was a small device, about the size of a car key, and a handwritten message. "Press this if you ever feel unsafe." That's all. No call, no explanation. Dominic. She lifted the device. It was cold and heavy, small but solid. No logo, no label. She didn't know what it did or what would happen if she pressed it, but she knew one thing: Dominic never joked. And he never did anything for show. That night, she set it on her bedside table beside her phone, turned off the lights, and lay still in the dark, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Part of her felt protected. Another part felt bound by something she couldn't name. The feeling pulled in opposite directions inside her chest, a tension she couldn't ease. The next morning, when the black car was waiting again, she got in without hesitation. But this time, she spoke, her eyes straight ahead, voice quiet. "Tell him I don't need someone shadowing me all the time. If he really wants to help, let me breathe." The driver gave a small nod, silent as ever. But less than 10 minutes after she arrived at the office, her phone buzzed. A message from Dominic. "Breathe, Charlie. But don't forget the wind in this city can change directions fast. And sometimes, the moment you think you're safest is the moment everything collapses." She stared at the words, her chest heavy. She hated to admit it, but something in that message stayed with her. Charlotte began noticing the small details. A man in a brown leather jacket standing on the same corner 3 days in a row, pretending to read a newspaper but never turning the page. A strange woman in her usual cafe, ordering only a glass of water, staring at her phone like she was recording something. A beat-up silver sedan that always appeared behind her when she drove home, even when she deliberately changed routes 3 times. She wasn't paranoid. She had spent years running high-profile events, trained to notice faces and patterns in a crowd. She knew when eyes were on her. And now, every sense she had was sounding alarms. What unsettled her most was not knowing whether these watchers belonged to Dominic or not. If they were his, they worked too smoothly, too invisibly, leaving no trace. But these ones clumsy, careless, obvious made her feel as if she'd crossed an invisible line she never meant to. That night, she lowered the blinds earlier than usual. She kept the living room dark, leaving only the soft light from the kitchen. She sat at the dining table, phone in front of her, the device Dominic had given her beside it, her palms cold. She didn't want to call him. She didn't want to give him another reason to tighten his grip. But she couldn't pretend nothing was happening either. After almost 20 minutes of hesitation, she picked up the device and pressed it. No sound, no light, nothing. She almost thought it was broken until the doorbell rang 10 minutes later. It wasn't Dominic standing outside, but Marco, the man who had been with him that night at the rooftop bar. His eyes were sharp, his voice calm. "Miss Monroe, we need you to come with us right now." "Go where?" "Somewhere safer. I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me what's going on." Marco didn't yield. "Mr. Valenti received an emergency signal from you. We've confirmed someone is monitoring your building. They're not ours. He doesn't want to take chances." She gripped the strap of her purse, studying his face. "How long has he known?" "About 3 days. But he waited to see if they were curious or had intent. And now?" "Now they have intent." Charlotte said nothing. She turned back inside, grabbed her coat, checked her wallet and phone, and stepped out, doubt still burning in her chest. The black car waited. Again. But it was a different model this time. Darker, tinted windows, no visible plates. Marco didn't speak during the 40-minute drive out of downtown. As the car turned down a tree-lined road, leaving behind the city lights and the distant horns, Charlotte began to feel real unease. They stopped before a large stone house draped in ivy, secluded behind a wrought iron gate. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows, and she could see the outline of someone waiting inside. Dominic opened the door just as she stepped out. He wasn't in a suit, just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the top button undone. He didn't look like a kingpin. Just a man waiting for someone he didn't want to lose. "Charlie," he said, voice low but gentle. "Are you all right?" "For now," she answered, stepping into the house. "But I want to know what's happening. All of it." Dominic nodded. "You will. But first you're safe here. They won't find this place." "Who are they?" "Vincent Morgan's men." The name hit her memory like a faint knock. Ella had mentioned him once, a former business partner Dominic had cut ties with over a dirty deal. No one in their circle had heard from him since. Until now. "Why is he interested in me?" she asked quietly. Dominic watched her for a long moment. "Because you're the first person who ever defied me. In front of everyone. And you didn't break. You made me pay attention. And he knows anyone who has my attention is worth exploiting." She tightened her fist slightly. "So what do you do next?" "Increase protection," Dominic said, eyes steady on hers. "And keep you closer. The words fell heavy between them. Not as a command, but as a truth. This was no longer a game, no longer a wager. This was a war, and whether she meant to or not, Charlotte Monroe was already in it. And Dominic had made his choice. He would not let her face it alone. The house lay more than 45 minutes from the city center, wrapped in trees and an absolute hush. No blare of horns, no neon glare, no trace of the urban life Charlotte had known for so many years. Only wind combing the leaves, the scent of pine, and the damp breath of soil after the night's rain. She stood before the tall iron gate, the black sport utility vehicle that had brought them idling behind her, and ahead a stone path leading to a 2-story home where old-world lines met modern edges, gray brick walls, wide panes of glass, and a veranda draped in thick green vines. Dominic stepped out first, his gaze sweeping the grounds with the reflex of a man who must always check every angle before letting anyone pass. She could not tell whether he truly believed this place was safe, or whether the calm was a mask he kept in place to steady her. When he circled back to open her door, something in his eyes softened. He was no longer the calculating boss weighing every risk. He was a man trying to prove something that mattered. More. "Welcome," he said in a quiet baritone. "At the very least it is calm enough to hear yourself think." Charlotte stepped down, her eyes fixed on the house. "Is this your private home?" "It is where I go when I need quiet. Very few people know it exists. No one can find it without my word, so I live in that world now. A world with no address, no passers-by, a place that survives in the dark. Not live," he said, "only stay, until I am certain no one can lay a hand on you." Inside, the air held leather and ebony wood, a warmth that settled in the chest. The furnishings were spare yet refined, each piece chosen with care, nothing superfluous, nothing random. She noticed at once. Unlike mansions designed to dazzle, this place bore a strong signature, a part of Dominic, quiet, guarded, and unmistakable. He led her through the living room and down a long corridor that opened toward the back, where light from the garden slipped through the curtains, casting a tranquil scene like a painting. "Your room is at the end of the hall on the right. There is a wardrobe, a private bath, and a window over the woods. If you need anything, tell Marco or tell me." Charlotte stopped and turned to him. "And if I want to leave?" Dominic met her eyes without flinching. "You can, but not now. Not while Morgan's men drift near the streets where you like to walk or the cafe where you sit each morning. Not when you are the reason he is sending a message to me. I do not want to be a pawn in your game. You are not," he said. "You are the one thing he cannot touch, and that is the point." The answer stilled her. It was not the words so much as the look that carried them. No possession, no threat, no promise to keep her at any cost. Only a quiet resolve, a wordless protection. Night fell faster out here where there was no city glow. Standing at the window that faced the garden, she felt everything tilt into unfamiliar shapes. She had never imagined she would find herself in such a world. She was an independent woman who trusted reason, who had long believed that love was secondary in modern life. Yet now she stood in the orbit of a man no one dared to name loudly in public because a single look from him could rearrange everything. Charlotte wondered whether she was entering his life or being swept into it. But when Dominic knocked and appeared in the doorway with eyes both gentle and edged with worry, she only nodded. "Thank you," she said, for the first time, without any armor at all. He nodded back and slipped away, and she knew that whatever darkness his world contained, this moment beneath the soft gold light and the vast quiet was the safest she had felt in years. By morning the room was full of sun. The thin white curtain trembled in a mild breeze from the cracked window. The piece was so complete, it felt almost staged. No horns, no hurried footsteps, no hiss of an office espresso machine. Only birdsong floating from far off and a faint thread of oak in the air. She rose, shrugged on a light robe, and went downstairs. Dominic was at the dining table. Breakfast set out with coffee, toast, eggs, and a newspaper open to the last pages. Not because he was reading them, but because he never read the front. That was where the stories lived about violence done in his name or worse, pinned to him by others. He looked up as she entered. "Good morning," he said in that even baritone, and his eyes held an unhidden gentleness. "Did you sleep?" "Quiet to the point of strangeness," she answered, taking the chair across from him. She lifted the cup, drew in a steadying breath of coffee. "How long do you plan to keep me here?" Dominic did not answer at once. He cut a square of toast, chewed, and spoke only then. Until every thread is gone. And if that never happens, then you still stay. Her cup struck the table harder than she meant. You are keeping me like a prisoner. His face did not change. No. I am keeping you from becoming a moving target in a war you did not choose. But you did not ask whether I wanted to be kept. If I asked, you would refuse. That is my right, and this is my responsibility. No voices rose, yet each sentence landed like a cold blade between them on the breakfast table. Charlotte stood and crossed to the tall glass doors that opened onto the garden. Pale lavender stirred in the breeze, tender and strange. I know you mean well, she said slowly, but I cannot live where each step is monitored, each decision approved, each day spent waiting for someone to tell me when I am allowed to breathe. Dominic remained still, his eyes on her. I am not controlling you, Charlie. I am protecting you. From whom? From Morgan, or from you? He came forward, his voice lower now, like a whisper held between breaths. I am not forcing you to love me. I am not asking for gratitude. But if you think I will stand by and watch you swept into a hunt where the target is the woman who has my attention, then you do not know me at all. Charlotte turned to face him. Then let me choose. Protection is not the same as captivity. Love is not the same as holding everything in your fist. Dominic studied her for a long moment and inclined his head. All right. On one condition. What is it? Stay here 3 more days. If after that you want to leave, I will not stop you. She was silent. 3 days. Not a lifetime. Not forever. Long enough to test every border. At last she nodded. 3 days. But do not expect me to behave. Dominic smiled for the first time that morning. I have never expected that from you. She returned to the table and refilled her cup. The aroma remained warm, but doubt still crowded her chest. In Dominic's world, nothing was simple, not even kindness, and she knew one thing with a clarity that rattled her heart. She was not afraid of being caged. She was afraid of feeling safe inside the cage. The second night in the villa passed with an uncanny quiet. Charlotte could not sleep, even with the soft bed and the perfectly balanced pillows. Even with every sound dampened to near silence, something inside her kept turning, as if instinct were warning her that something was about to arrive. Near midnight she stepped out of her room, bare feet on the cool wood, her silk robe stirring lightly with each step. A faint glow spilled from the office downstairs. She moved toward it, ready to turn back, then stopped when she heard a thread of music, a low, mournful strain of classic jazz humming from an old player. She tapped gently on the door. I cannot sleep, she said when Dominic looked up. He did not seem surprised. He only nodded and motioned her in. The room was the color of dark wood, shelves crowded with books, a few old paintings on the walls, and a large desk where stacks of papers lay in precise order. Dominic sat behind it, white shirt open at the collar without a tie, the top 2 buttons undone. He did not look like a dangerous man. He looked like someone who had been sleepless for a very long time. Do you always stay up this late? Charlotte asked, leaning lightly against the desk. Only on nights that require thinking, he said. About me. Not only about you, but you are in it. She said nothing, holding his gaze. In the low light, his eyes carried something unusual. Weariness, and something deeper. You control everything, she murmured. But not every wound is yours to command. Dominic did not answer at once. He stood, crossed to the bookcase, and lifted an old framed photograph into his hand. He did not show it to her. He looked at it for a long while before he spoke. I once loved someone. His voice did not shake, and it did not catch, yet it bore a heavy resonance. When I was very young, before I became the man this city is afraid to name. Charlotte did not interrupt. She waited. Her name was Elena. She was the only person who made me believe another life could be real. A life beyond numbers, beyond power, beyond strategy. We planned to leave this place, to live in Italy and open a small shop by the sea. He paused and drew a slow breath. But she betrayed me. Charlotte tilted her head. Betrayed. She was a plant sent to get close to me, part of a larger plan by another family. By the time I learned the truth, it was too late. She did not only take information. Because of a location she provided, I lost a brother in an ambush. And you. I forgave her, Dominic said, meeting her eyes as he spoke. Not because I am a fool. because a part of me still wanted to believe she had been sincere, even if only for a moment. Is she alive? No. His voice sank. She chose her end before someone else could do it for her. A chill traced Charlotte's spine. Not fear. It was the first time she saw the true ghost inside Dominic's eyes. Not the Mafia. Not power. Loss. Since then, he said, turning away, I have let no one near. Feeling, affection, attachment, all of it weakens a man. I cannot afford to be weak again. Not once more. Then why me? Charlotte asked steadily. Because you are not her, Dominic answered at once, almost a whisper. You do not want anything from me. You challenge me. You say what I do not want to hear, and you never hide a blade behind your back. You are the first to make me forget to be on guard. She stepped closer, her eyes softening. I am not perfect, Dominic. I will not promise never to hurt you, but I am not Elena, and you know that. He nodded slightly, his mouth folding into a small, rueful smile without looking at her. I know. Old wounds have long memories. Charlotte set a hand lightly on his arm, an uncalculated gesture with no strategy in it. And sometimes a memory needs to be rewritten. He lifted his gaze to hers, dark as a well, and this time without the armor. She said nothing else. She simply stood there and let the silence bridge the last inch between them. And that night, for the first time in a very long time, Dominic Valenti allowed the past to retreat, if only by a little. By morning a thin mist lay over the villa. From the bedroom window Charlotte looked out on the garden where the trees stood like statues, motionless and mute. Everything felt still in a strange way, not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that makes a person sit up in the middle of the night certain that something is prowling just beyond the edge of sight. This was not the hush of calm. It was breath held before a door flies open. Dominic did not appear at breakfast. Marco handed her a cup of coffee and said Dominic had an early meeting downstairs. But Charlotte knew better. She felt something shifting, not only in the eyes of the guards posted throughout the house, but in the air itself. Phone calls were made in murmurs. Messages were traded with glances. Eyes tracked her for a heartbeat too long when she passed. She began noticing what she had previously let slide past. A city map pinned to the office wall marked with red points. Documents printed on heavy stock, stamped with the seal of an organization she did not recognize. A list of names, circled in black ink, and a photograph, her own, placed beside a picture of Vincent Morgan. When she stepped into Dominic's office that afternoon, he stood with his back to the door, staring out the window. He did not turn in surprise. I once hoped that keeping you away from my world would be enough to keep you safe, he said, voice even and low. It is not. Why? She asked, crossing the room, her palms going cold. Morgan is not only aiming at you to send a message, Dominic said, facing her now and holding her eyes. He is planning to use you as leverage. Not because of who you are, because you are the one person I cannot lose. Her heart missed a beat. It was not the romance of the words that struck her, but their stark truth. In Dominic's world, feeling was a weakness, and weakness was always hunted first. When did you know? 2 days ago, Dominic said without flinching. A source inside Morgan's circle confirmed he knows about you. He is watching everyone close to me. You are first on the list. So, you kept me here. There is no choice now, Charlie. You are not merely involved, you are a target. She tightened her hands. What had been suspicion hardened into an inescapable fact. Every time she stepped outside, every step she took, someone was watching. Not because she mattered, but because she could make Dominic falter. I am not a weapon, she said, her voice cold. I am not a lever for anyone, I know, and I will not let you become one, by locking me here, by preparing for the worst and refusing to leave you alone again. She turned away, eyes burning. Not with fear, with anger. Anger that she had let feeling overrun reason. Anger that she had believed the bond between them was real and free of power, history, and enemies. Now she stood in the very world Dominic had tried to hide. A world where everything was a transaction, even the heart. That evening Dominic asked her to the back terrace for dinner. No staff. Only 2 people, a bottle of red wine, and a simple plate of pasta he had cooked himself. The soft gold light warmed his face, his eyes more tired than usual. I know you are angry, he said after a few minutes of quiet. Not because I told you that you are a target. Because you realized I have known it for longer than I said." Charlotte did not answer right away. She sipped her wine and looked into the distance. "I am only tired. Tired of thinking I had stepped into a relationship, when in truth I stepped into a war." Dominic was silent. Then he set down his glass and met her gaze. "Then let me ask once, only once. If you want to leave, I will let you go. If you stay, you have to know, this calm is temporary, the storm is coming, and if we stand together, we do not lose each other." Charlotte watched him for a long time, then she nodded, small and sure. "Then do not let me fall before it arrives." And that was the moment Dominic knew that when the war broke, he would not be fighting alone. Rain fell the next afternoon, fine as threads, silvering the garden behind the villa. Charlotte sat in the reading room near the terrace, a novel in her hands, though her eyes could not follow a single line. There was something wrong in the air, a vague and clear unease at once, like the half-click of a clock out of time that only she could hear. Dominic had left at dawn with Marco, saying he needed to meet a go-between who had contacted Morgan's side to verify the source. He promised to return the same day, told her not to leave the villa, and if anything seemed off to press the emergency device she kept with her at all times. Charlotte was not easily rattled, but his absence made the spaces feel colder. The guards held their posts, nodded as she passed, kept their trained faces. Yet, when she crossed the second-floor corridor to fetch another book, the look from one of them made her stop. It lingered too long, not the watch of protection but the prying of appraisal. She had seen that glint in the eyes of strangers who tailed her in Chicago. At night, while she was in the kitchen making coffee, her phone rang. An unknown number. She hesitated a heartbeat and answered. No one spoke, only rushed breathing, then a hurried whisper. "They are not all loyal to him. Be careful with the man posted near the back door." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the screen and felt her chest tighten. Charlotte set the phone down and moved quickly to the security room, the place where she had seen Marco monitor every angle of the house. No one was there. The screens were bright, showing 4 views of the grounds. She focused on the rear feed and saw exactly what the warning described. The guard on that post was Tyler, one of the newer hires from 2 weeks earlier. Always quiet, always on time, eyes that never truly met another's. Just as she looked away, a door opened below. Instinct pulled her hand to the light switch. She killed the room lights and slipped behind the half-closed door. Footsteps entered, heavy and certain. Tyler. He scanned the screens, letting his eyes sweep each frame until they stopped on the camera trained on the corridor that led to her room. He pulled out his phone, tapped a quick message, and left without noticing her breath held inches away in the dark. Charlotte no longer had doubt. She ran to her room, locked the door, pulled out the device Dominic had given her, and pressed it for 3 seconds. A tiny light blinked, a soft vibration pulsed, and then nothing. 10 minutes later, the villa gates swung open, and Dominic's car cut through the drive like an arrow. He stepped out with a face like storm cloud. Marco was behind him, eyes like knives. Dominic kicked open the security room door and his voice cracked the air. "Where is Tyler?" No one answered. Every gaze tilted toward the hall. Then they saw the back door standing wide. Charlotte flew down the stairs and met Dominic in the main foyer. "I am sure it was him," she said, breath ragged. He went into the security room, sent a message to someone, and watched the path to my room. Dominic did not ask another question. He ordered a sweep of the woods behind the house. Within 20 minutes, they found a phone tossed behind a shrub and a tiny earpiece clipped to the inside of a discarded guard collar. The phone held a single unsent message still in drafts. "She will step out at 7 in the evening by the back door. Be ready to take her." Dominic stared at the words for a long time, then smashed the phone against the stone counter. "They are closer than we thought." That night, the villa doubled its security. Dominic did not leave Charlotte's side for a single step, but she knew his anger was not only fear of losing her. It was the knowledge that a traitor had been hiding among men he trusted. From that moment, the war was no longer a thing on the horizon. It had already begun, and this time no one would be standing at a safe distance. The night sky above the villa held not a single star, only a dense blackness as if every shard of light had been swallowed whole, and Charlotte sat on a wooden chair on the back terrace with a thin blanket over her shoulders, staring into the empty space ahead, while the aftershocks of the afternoon still trembled inside her, because survival had brought no peace, only a heavier gravity to everything. And Dominic stepped out a few minutes later with no bodyguards, no phone, None of the iron hardness people expected, only himself in a dark sweater, his stride unhurried and steady. And he did not ask if she wanted to talk and offered no reason for coming. He simply took the chair beside her and let silence say what it needed. And after a long time, Charlotte spoke, her voice rough as if it might break, saying she had not understood how close the danger had come, that if she had not looked at the camera at that exact moment, or answered that call, and Dominic said nothing, and only nodded, his eyes fixed on her, and she turned toward him with eyes red but unwavering, and asked why he had not told her sooner that she was a target, and that his caring for her had made her his weak point. And he straightened, and his gaze deepened as though he had set down the last mask, and he said he had hoped it would not be true, that if he were careful enough and kept his distance, she would not be pulled in, and she said she had been pulled in, and not by anyone else but by him. And he nodded, and his voice fell low and honest in a way she had never heard, as he said he knew, and there was nothing to justify it, only that he had not expected his feelings to go so far, that what began between them as a dare and a game had ended with a loss for him because he had allowed himself to care. And she shivered at those words, not from fear but because the admission made the past impossible to return to. And this was no longer about seductive lunches and daring glances and cautious sparring, because the line of the temporary had been crossed. And she drew a slow breath and said she did not blame him for caring. She blamed herself for letting everything outrun her control without seeing what waited behind it. And Dominic leaned toward her with his eyes locked to hers, and a voice soft as a vow and stern as a warning, as he said he would not let the afternoon happen again, that he had allowed a traitor too close because he had believed he could control everything, but that with her nothing could be left at just enough. There could be no partial protection, and no measured concern. It was everything or nothing. And Charlotte went still because in a world Dominic Valenti had built with calculation and iron rules, those words were not mere softness, but the first admission, that feeling, once real, would change every strategy. And she asked, "What about me?" as if testing herself, asking what if she said she was not ready to wake each day and ask whether she would live through it. What if she said she wanted to return to her old life and her old work and coffee at her familiar place, believing that no one was planning to kill her except some nameless madman on the street? And he did not evade and said he would not stop her, but he would remain behind her and keep watch and protect her. And if one day she needed him, she had only to press the button and he would come whether it was midnight or the center of a battlefield. And she looked at him for a long time, and for the first time did not feel fear or control in his words, because she knew there was no command and no scheme in them, only a truth he could not hide, that he cared. And that was why she had become a target, and also why she could stand without breaking. And she told him not to call it a game, because she did not play to win. She played to avoid waking one day to a life of regret. And Dominic tilted his head with the faintest curve of his mouth, not of victory but of something deeper, and said nothing in this will be temporary any longer. Charlie. And in that moment, with the rain ticking softly and the night drawn thick around them, both knew there was no way back. The game had ended, the lines were drawn, and the heart had no room left for hesitation. And near 3 a.m, Dominic was still awake with the office lights burning, and reports spread across the dark wood desk beside a cup of black coffee gone cold, while Charlotte stood just beyond the half-open door with her shoulder against the frame and watched him as if trying to read something hidden deeper than the plan scattered before him. And he did not raise his head, and still knew she was there, and told her she should sleep, and she answered she could not, and that he was not sleeping either. And then he looked up at her as if one glance could quiet the noise for a few seconds, before he looked down again and opened a city map, marked with careful red points, and said their intelligence had confirmed that Morgan had left his main base in New Jersey and was on the move and not alone, that he had met an old associate named Julian Hart, who specialized in strategic assaults, a man who had once worked with him on an arms run in Europe before they split over disagreements, and who now seemed to have found common ground again. And Charlotte came to his side and looked down at the map, and asked what the points were, and he said communications, stations and warehouses, and checkpoints, and that a heavy red circle on the western side of the city marked the location, where encrypted signals had spiked over the past 3 days. Many outgoing calls from a device that used the codes Morgan had relied on before. And when she asked if he was about to strike, Dominic said, not about to, but already planning. And Marco entered with fresh printouts, and said news from Lucas's network showed that someone in Morgan's group had approached one of their shippers, and asked for the movement map of the people inside the villa, especially Charlie, and Dominic's hands tightened, and he said they were ready to move. And Marco nodded and said they were positioning for either an ambush or a hit and vanish, but certainly aiming at the soft point. And Charlotte turned to Dominic and said, "I am the soft point." And he held her gaze and said, "No, you are the reason I will not step back." And the air thickened, not with fear but with the sense of something large rolling toward them like far thunder from a storm not yet visible though the body already chilled. And Charlotte pulled a chair beside him and spread another map and asked how much time they had, and he said worst case 24 hours and best case 48. And she asked for their plan, and he told Marco to double security and move every piece of data off the villa's servers and alert every contact point to prepare for immediate relocation. And then he looked back at Charlotte with his eyes softened and said she would be moved to another location in the morning with her own team. And she said no and refused, and he called her name and she said if she left she would become a moving target, and at least here they knew their ground and their preparations. And Marco inclined his head and told Dominic she had a point, and Dominic studied her for a long breath and nodded and said, "Then we prepare for war." And Charlotte gripped the edge of the map, with her heart pounding and her gaze steady, because she was no longer a woman who had stumbled into a mafioso's world by accident. She was in it now, and it was time to stand with him, without stepping back. Because the echoes of the enemy were no longer distant, they were closing in, and this time there would be no one left outside. Gunfire cracked through the old warehouse like a tolling death bell, harsh and cold, and Marco moved first, dragging Charlotte flat to the concrete while his body covered hers as a round sliced past her head and punched into a steel drum behind them, throwing a brief spark, and Dominic, wounded, forced himself upright, his eyes cutting the space to find the pawn, shooter, and all of it took less than 2 seconds, which in the world of bullets is enough to decide between life and death. And 4 of them, southwest. Marco shouted as he yanked the Glock from his waistband and fired in quick succession, the rounds ripping the air and ricocheting among the crates. And then came the shatter of glass and the drum of running feet, and Charlotte crawled to Dominic and lifted his face in both hands and asked if he could stand. And he ground his teeth, one hand pressed to the wound along his ribs, eyes steady, saying he did not need to stand. He needed to shoot, and Marco tossed him the backup, and Dominic caught it left-handed, checked the magazine with a glance, and snapped toward the entryway, where 2 men surged in and dropped under 2 clean shots. And Charlotte's heart hammered so hard, it felt as if it would burst her chest as she pressed to a concrete pillar with the small pistol Marco had given her when they left the villa, and she had never fired on a person before, but when a dark figure rushed them with a raised gun, survival outran fear, and she squeezed the trigger, and the first report jolted her. Then the second round struck the man's shoulder, pitching him down as his weapon skittered away. And there was no time to tremble or panic as she slid past him, snatched up the rifle, and reloaded as Marco had taught her, and heavy boots pounded from the side corridor, so Marco pitched a smoke grenade that flowered into a dense gray wall. "And we need to move," he yelled, hauling Dominic up and waving Charlotte close, and they ran the narrow lane formed by stacked containers until a burst of automatic fire tore the air and froze them in place, and another man lay in wait, his machine gun spitting like a flame beast, and Dominic dove forward, rolled, fired once, twice, 3 times, and at the 4th the gunman folded with a smear of blood across the cement, and Marco rushed in, checked, signaled clear, and they pushed on, over rattling iron plates, breath ragged, and Dominic's knees began to give as blood soaked his shirt, and Charlotte braced him with an arm, fear burning her eyes. "And we are close to the exit," Marco said, pointing to a steel door less than 10 meters ahead, and then a figure stepped into their path, Vincent Morgan in black with a gun in his hand and a face so calm it chilled. "And Valenti," he said with a thin smile, "I did not think you would bring your treasure to me, and yet how human of you." And Dominic tightened his grip, but Morgan leveled straight at Charlotte. "One more step and I shoot. And do not touch her," Dominic hissed with blood at the corner of his mouth. "She has nothing to do with the game between you and me." And Morgan shrugged. "But she is the card that ends it." And behind, Marco slid left with a grenade in his fist, and Dominic saw and went very still for a heartbeat, then turned to Charlotte and whispered, "When I say fall, do it." And she had no time to ask before. Marco flung the grenade and Dominic shouted fall and pulled her down hard, and the blast slammed the air and smoke boiled across the lane, and in the chaos Dominic threw himself forward, using the last of his strength to cover Charlotte while Marco laid down fire, and they slid toward the steel door, and Morgan vanished into the murk. And when they burst into the rear lot, the support team from the villa had arrived, and Dominic collapsed as the armored door slammed shut, and Charlotte cradled him with blood slicking her hands, not knowing whose it was. And he opened his eyes one last time before the dark took him and whispered, "You did well, Charlie." And then he went under in her arms, and Charlotte knew the war was far from over. But for now, the man she loved was breathing, and that was enough to carry her into the next fight. And they took Dominic back to the villa half-conscious. The bleeding stanched, but his face pale as if the last light had been drained in the instant before. Everything went black, and Charlotte stayed by his bed all night without closing her eyes. Her hand locked with his, not to hold him to life but to hold herself to something still present in a world overturned by gunfire and betrayal. And the room's quiet held only the soft hum of the drip and the warm gold wash over the face of a man she had once believed was only a wager and a spark in a loud Chicago bar. And now he lay there breathing thinly and still fighting to keep the promise not to let her go. And when the sun thinned through the heavy curtains and touched the sheets, Dominic stirred and his lids trembled and lifted, and pain still clouded his gaze. Yet when he saw Charlotte, it cleared as if he had climbed out of a dream just to make sure she remained. "And you did not leave," he rasped. And she nodded with wet eyes and said she had told him she would not stay behind, and he tried to squeeze her fingers and managed only a small shift. "And are you all right?" he asked, and she smiled through tears and said he was the one who should ask that. And the room fell into a silence of steady monitors and shared breath, a language only they understood. And she tightened her hold and did not look away, and said his name, and drew a breath as if to gather all her courage for what she had never thought she would confess. That he had been right about everything, about his world not being simple, about loving a man like him meaning stepping onto a field of battle, about men like him never doing anything by halves. And she said she had been wrong. And Dominic closed his eyes, perhaps from fatigue, perhaps to hide the feeling that had risen, then opened them with a gentleness no words could carry, and told her she owed him no apology. And she whispered, "No, but I owe you one thing, an acknowledgement." And she bent close, her breath warm at his ear, and said, "You won the bet." And he laughed softly and winced and said the most foolish wager of his life. And she smiled for the first time since his shirt ran red, a smile free of fear, and said it was the only wager she did not regret taking. And he gripped her hand, stronger this time, and asked if she was his now. And she nodded and said not because she was a prize, but because she chose to stay, that even if the world kept exploding and Morgan returned, and the ghosts of his past still lacked names, she would not step back. And he closed his eyes and shaped one word, Charlie. And in that instant there was no Mafia, and no blood, and no dare, and no stray rounds. Only a man and a woman who had crossed too much loss to keep pretending that love begins in softness, because sometimes it begins with a reckless bet and ends in a truth spoken from the deepest part of the heart. And she told him he had proved her wrong and that she had never been so glad to be wrong. The autumn wind drifted through the trees behind the villa, carrying the damp scent of soil and the faint musk of decaying wood from a forest near Lake, Michigan. Charlotte sat on the long wooden bench beneath the porch roof, a half-open book resting in her hands, though her eyes had not moved across a line in several minutes. The stillness around her was unnatural, no whir of helicopters circling above, no click of radios passing coded orders between guards. Yet that quiet did not calm her, it unsettled her. Dominic had only just returned from a private meeting with Lucas, the man who oversaw intelligence across his entire network. He had said little when he entered the house, only paused long enough to look at her before setting his coat aside and walking straight into his office. Charlotte followed minutes later, knowing the silence wasn't the sound of peace but of something vast waiting in the dark to move. Dominic stood facing the window, arms folded, watching the empty yard where the morning birds had not appeared. When she stepped inside, he did not turn, but his voice, low and thoughtful, carried through the room. When things grow too quiet, it isn't because they have stopped. It's because someone is waiting for the exact moment to strike. Charlotte moved closer and laid her hand gently on his arm. "You think Morgan is still alive?" Dominic nodded without shifting his gaze. "Men like him do not die easily, and if he is alive, he will never forgive what we destroyed. This silence is how he makes us believe the war is over. We can't live forever in fear," she said softly. "I'm not afraid," he replied, turning to her, the sleepless nights still clouding his eyes. I'm worried because I no longer fight only for myself. With you here, I can't risk the way I used to. Charlotte tightened her grip on his arm, her voice quiet but certain. I'm not something fragile you have to protect. I was beside you until the last shot, and I won't step back now just because you're afraid of losing me. He looked at her for a long moment before nodding. I know. Still, sometimes I wish I could place you somewhere, untouchable, somewhere my past could never reach. There's no such place, Dominic, and if there were, it would be a world without you and I won't live there. Her words fell softly but left a deep stillness inside him. He drew her into his arms, and for that brief moment there was nothing left to promise. Then his phone vibrated. Dominic pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. It's from the Western satellite station. The alert system caught a repeating coded signal, the same pattern Morgan used before. It's back. Charlotte stepped back, her eyes wide. You think it's him, or whoever took his place. Either way, the game isn't finished. He crossed to the desk, opened the large screen, and the red dots returned, scattered like blood over the map. Around them, the air seemed to thicken with an invisible mist, the kind made of worry, of readiness, of knowing that peace was only the pause between explosions. Charlotte joined him without a word. They had lived through enough to know words weren't needed, only presence, only resolve. And if war came again, they would not retreat. Dominic set his hands on the desk, his voice calm but cutting. They think the world is quiet? Then they'll learn soon enough silence isn't peace. It's the final warning. Charlotte's hand found his, and in their shared gaze they both knew their lives would never be still, but they would belong to each other, no matter who returned from the shadows. At dawn, mist still veiled the lake behind the villa, thin as a curtain drawn between memory and the present. Charlotte sat on the stone steps, wrapped in a long sweater that fell past her knees, a steaming cup of coffee warming her palms as her eyes drifted toward the pale horizon where the pines dissolved into light. The calm here was almost too pure, too far removed from the hum of traffic, the crowds, the yellow city glow that had once defined her world. 3 weeks had passed since Dominic had survived the ambush at the warehouse, 3 weeks of strict protection, doubled security, guards who never looked away, and a Dominic who had grown quieter with each sunrise. As though his wounds had burrowed deeper than the flesh, Charlotte did not love him for his power or for the world he commanded. She loved him because behind that cold precision was a man who had relearned how to love silently, fiercely, like a flame burning low but steady. Yet she also knew she wasn't born to live forever behind high walls, under cameras and security briefings. She belonged to the city, to its rush, its noise, its pulse of life where fear hid not in gunfire but in too much quiet. She missed the breath of the streets, the scent of asphalt after rain, the echo of footsteps on pavement, and the freedom of disappearing into a crowd without looking over her shoulder. When Dominic came outside, he saw her from a distance, small, still, gazing toward the edge of the woods as if her thoughts were already beyond his reach. He walked to her without a word. Charlotte didn't turn, but she felt his presence behind her. I want to go back to the city, she said, calm but certain. He was silent for a long moment. I know. Not because I'm tired, not because I'm afraid, she continued. But if we have to hide in the dark to stay safe, then what kind of love is that? I don't want to wake every morning checking a security map before I kiss the man I love. Dominic looked down at the coffee in her hands as if searching its steam for an answer he hadn't wanted to face. I built this world to keep enemies away, he said quietly. Maybe I've been hiding from myself too. Charlotte turned to him, her eyes soft. I don't want you to change, Dominic. I want you to choose. Choose what? Choose to live, not to hide. He looked at her for a long time, remembering the first night he met her on a rooftop bar in Chicago, the way her eyes had defied everything, the way she had said you couldn't. Handle me like a spark thrown into the storm, he thought he commanded. He had crossed blood, betrayal, and fire to reach her. But if keeping her meant trapping her in glass, then what was left of love? I'm afraid, he admitted. I'm afraid that if you walk back into that world, I won't be able to keep you safe. Charlotte smiled faintly. That's the point, Dominic. I don't need protection from the world. I need to live in it, and I need you to live there with me. The wind stirred a few loose strands of her hair across her face. Dominic reached to smooth them back, and in that gesture, his eyes were no longer those of a man feared by an empire, but of one who finally understood that love wasn't possession, it was walking beside someone. Facing the fear together. Then we go back, he said softly. But not as before. This time we don't run, and neither of us hides. Charlotte nodded, her eyes bright with the first light of morning. They had come too far to mistake stillness for peace. True calm lived only in how they chose to keep moving through cities or forests, danger or dawn. And if destiny was something they had once defied, then now it was something they would rewrite together. No more hiding, no more regret. That late afternoon, as the last light lingered on the fiery canopy of Millennium Park's autumn trees, Dominic and Charlotte walked side by side along the winding stone path by the lake. They moved slowly, as if time itself had loosened its hold, as if there were no enemies left behind them, no shadows hiding among the crowds. To the casual eye, they were just two people in love. There were no obvious bodyguards trailing 3 steps behind, no armored car idling openly at the corner. Charlotte breathed in the crisp autumn air, relishing the feeling of normalcy, the freedom of disappearing into a crowd without looking over her shoulder. But as they passed a man pretending to read a newspaper by the fountain, Charlotte caught his gaze for just a fraction of a second. It was steady, familiar, and not focused on the paper. She glanced further, toward a woman pushing an empty stroller, and recognized the subtle stiffness in her posture. They weren't alone. They would never be truly alone. A faint smile touched Charlotte's lips. This was Dominic's compromise. Not a cage, but an invisible fortress built around her in the middle of the city. He had respected her wish to live, not to hide. She tightened her hand in his. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" she murmured, glancing up at him. Dominic's mouth curved into that rare, quiet smile, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. "I call it handling." Charlotte looked at the man beside her, her hand resting easily in his unhidden, and, thanks to his silent promise, truly unafraid. Dominic said nothing, yet his eyes held her with the quiet reverence of a man who had learned that every heartbeat in this moment was worth more than any victory he had ever claimed. They had walked through gunfire, betrayal, and traps woven from deceit and power. There had been moments when it seemed everything would end in blood, that fate would never allow love to bloom amid rival empires. But now, they stood here alive, together, shaped by loss and faith that had outlasted danger. Charlotte stopped beneath a crimson maple, turned to him, and smiled faintly. "Do you remember the first time I told you you couldn't handle me?" Dominic's mouth curved again, his gaze carrying 1,000 memories. "And you were wrong, so very wrong." "I know," she said, nodding slowly. "But it's the one mistake I'll never regret." They walked on without speaking, but the silence between them was not heavy. It was peace, the kind they once believed they'd never touch, a life without hiding, a love without fear. It was not a gift. It was something earned, built from courage, trust, and the willingness to let go of fear in order to hold on to each other. The story of Dominic and Charlotte was never just about two people in love amid a dangerous underworld. It was a symbol of endurance, of courage, of the human power to change destiny through love and choice. Because sometimes, to reach true happiness, we must dare to step through fear, open our hearts after loss, and believe that we deserve to be loved, that we deserve to live a life unhidden.